Hello, I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. I'm the Dungeon Tutor. And I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Thanks for joining me. Hello, friends! I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. And today I want to address something that was broached to me by not somebody who's part of this community, but by someone who I've talked to numerous times, and they told me the reason why they really don't like Dungeons and Dragons, which is fine. Lots of people have their own reasons. But this person, an acquaintance of mine, said that the reason they didn't like Dungeons and Dragons is because they don't really like fantasy elements. They don't like elves and dwarves and orcs and dragons and the like as much. They have a hard time connecting with that, and even though there's plenty of resources out there that kind of show what fantasy is, they never really buy into it. They don't like ambient magic all over the place. They don't like necessarily having wizards and being stuck in kind of a pseudo-medieval Renaissance period. And I don't have a problem with that. There's a lot of genres to role-playing games that's there's a lot of itches to scratch, and game designers have come out with many, many games. But for some, Dungeons and Dragons is a no-sell. Even though there are a variety of flavors of Dungeons and Dragons, and every game master can tell a different game in a different way that might engage a person. For them, fantasy is a no-sell. So, okay. But I talked about some of the other kinds of games that are out there. And science fiction also, to this person, wasn't something they were all that interested in. Mostly because they liked a world that was grounded in reality, not somebody's imagination, either going forwards or going backwards. So that was trickier. Not saying there aren't plenty of modern day games or modern historical games that are available, but all the same, as I asked, is it the fact that there's fantasy elements to it? If it was a real life setting, but it had things that were supernatural, would you be okay? And they were. So then the subject came around to one of my favorite role-playing games, which I thought I would share with you today. And that one is Werewolf the Apocalypse. Now, Werewolf the Apocalypse is an original World of Darkness game. This came out, quite a few years ago as the Renaissance from Dungeons and Dragons was really hitting its stride with all these other games that gave different options other than what Dungeons and Dragons offered. And there's always been choices. TSR came out with Boot Hell, which was a Western, primarily miniatures combat game, but there was some roleplay element in that. And there have been sci-fi games since Metamorphosis Alpha, Star Frontier, So there have been other options. And certainly, even in terms of modern day, Top Secret, James Bond, if you want to go with, somewhat recent pseudo-historical, Indiana Jones, things like that. Werewolf, though, went away from many of the mechanics that made Dungeons and Dragons familiar, and had their own mechanics, had their own level of narrative play that even the game masters called the storyteller. So it kind of wears that on its sleeve. Now, along with Vampire the Masquerade, which came out first, their connected world, the World of Darkness. A world very much like ours, but with a supernatural layer to it. The answer to all of the questions that are out there historically are vampires did it, or werewolves did it, or something like that. Oh, the colony of Roanoke vanished. Well, that's probably werewolves that wiped them out. Probably the Croatan. If it was, what happened to the actual decline of the Roman Empire, it was the influence of vampires that crushed it. So that's kind of how the World of Darkness runs. Where Vampire is very interested in humanity, Werewolf is also interested in humanity, but a different angle. Instead of humanity being prey and food and useful tools, in Werewolf, they're almost always seen as the enemy. Werewolves are your ultimate eco-terrorists. They are fighting for the world. And the world in this case is anthropomorphized into the spirit of Gaia, a benevolent spirit that gave everything its existence, essentially. A creator spirit, very much tied into the earth, and the, again, mother of mankind and werewolves side by side. Now, almost all the werewolf traditions hold that werewolves are separate. They are not actually humans that have become cursed or have anything like that. Werewolves are completely different in that way, although it is easy to see from the storyline how lycanthropy can seem to be a curse, certainly. Also makes it fairly clear, if you read through the books and the lore, there's more changing breeds than just werewolves. So it gets a little complicated. And as a matter of fact, one of the knocks that you can give to werewolf is that it can get inordinately complicated. Hey, your badass werewolves going and fighting against the forces of evil trying to destroy the world sounds pretty straightforward. But one of the things that White Wolf did is they made it anything but. And again, one of the reasons why perhaps they decided to change so much when they basically went to their second rendition, they changed a lot of the trappings of the world and made it a little simpler. Werewolf could get rather complicated for your, again, savage werewolf character. You had an auspice, which was kind of your class, your role within society. It didn't change much of anything from character to character to character, except you had kind of the mixed blessing curse. If you were born under a moon closer to full, you would have more rage, which is a resource that you can spend in combat to be more amazing. But at the same time, your rage could cause you to lose control of yourself. It's that inherent bit of self-horror. No matter how awesome you are, no matter how well-intentioned you are, you could turn into a foaming, clawing, devouring force of destruction, and you have no say over it. It's all on the dice. That's kind of interesting, actually. But, first of all, as I said, Werewolf, a game with trappings, and anybody who understands modern society understands that because we all kind of wear them. We have our social class based on usually income. We might have a more distinct social class than that. We all have been born to different races, the color of our skin and where our backgrounds come from. So we can kind of understand that to a certain extent. Now take that in Werewolf to much more ludicrous degrees than just racism. There are some tribes, for instance, that are seen as utter garbage. The Bonars, for instance, the lowest of the low, are a tribe of the Guru, what werewolves call themselves, who almost revel in not having anything. They can work as hard as any of the other group, but they're never given credit for it. They are the dirty beggars of the group, but they're still werewolves. I mean, they're still awesomely, they have this potential to be absolute whirlwinds of destruction. They have oftentimes really good insights that other of the tribes don't get. The other thing about Bonars is that they often live close to humanity. The other tribes try to hold themselves away from humanity, with one notable exception we'll talk about. But they try to stay as far back from humanity because humanity is an agent of, well, that gets complicated. And again, you have to kind of go into Werewolf's entire backstory to understand that. Humans and werewolves have a complicated history. So, I guess to give you the big picture, it would be fairest to say there are three primal forces in the universe. There's the wild, the force of creation. There's the weaver that takes the creation and tries to make sense of it. And then there's the worm that tries to destroy so that everything is not overwrought. You have to get rid of some of the stuff. If you're going to create, you need to make room for those creations. So the balance of those three forces is important. Well, the balance has been thrown all out of whack. Humans are agents of the weaver. We try to give form to everything. We try to control. And the more we do that, we take what the wild gives us and we control, we package, we make it ours, we put our stamp on it, and that stagnates everything. Now the wild is going crazy trying to keep up, but we're bottling everything up and capturing what it's created. And the worm is just absolutely wants to destroy everything, wants to ravage everything, because there's so much that's been built up that is resisting its destruction, because we're trying to hold off destruction as much as possible by ourselves controlling everything, and everything is out of whack. A lot of it is, it's on humanity, isn't it? You know, we do all this stuff. There's a lesson in there. So, the werewolves are agents of the wild. They work for Gaia, the primal force of nature, the creator. And that means they're often at odds with humanity. Now, yeah, some of us humans choose to work with the wild. We're conservationists. We attempt to live as best as we can with the world as it is. But that doesn't always work. And there are plenty of people who don't care about the wild. They don't even care really about the Weaver. There are some people who are sick and just want to see it all torn down and burned. And they work for the worm willingly. Now, if you add a spiritual aspect to all of that, and there's actually, you know, worm spirits, and that can tempt people to do those kind of things, it gets even more dark and twisted. That's why it is a world of darkness. There is a huge veil of darkness that hangs over all of this, as the Weaver and the worm conflict with each other, but the Guru on the side of Gaia and the wild have to try to stop the worm from devouring all that is. They also take potshots at the Weaver to stop it from calcifying everything into its absolutely rigid reality, which actually serves to break the natural boundaries. The werewolves have an ability to go into a spirit world. Physically, they can just pop over. If they see themselves in a reflection, they can do this. Sometimes. Sometimes not when it's convenient that they should, but, you know, that's something else. But that distinction gets calcified, gets harder and harder to break that boundary as the Weaver takes over the world more and more. That's a big tool that the werewolves would hate to lose. So they rail against the Weaver, but they are absolutely determined to destroy the agents of the worm that are trying to destroy the world. Now, that's the greater picture, and that's something that most of the werewolves, the Guru, agree with. Most of them. Then you've got all of those werewolves that are divided up into tribes. Now, each of these tribes has an archetype. What everybody expects of them, and kind of their default nature. And I'm not going to go over all of it. It's an interesting but intricate game. You've got some tribes that really try not to rock the boat and really don't have a great voice, like the Soundstriders and the Stargazers. You have the leaders of the group, who are represented by the Silverfangs. They are the Blue Bloods. They are the nobility. And they think they deserve to rule just because the great deeds of their ancestors and the fact they have certain gifts that entitle them to be the leaders, and it's all such a terrible burden, but it's one we must put up with. And as a result, the rest of you dogs owe us your loyalty. There is inherent advantages and strengths in your choice of your tribe, but also inherent flaws. Expect people to box you up with the rest of your tribe and treat you a certain way. That's oftentimes not very convenient. Now, also werewolves, they can turn from wolves to humans to their in-between phases where, you know, the typical werewolf, the half-man, half-wolf, huge claws, big teeth, the war form, the Krynos, as they're called. They have that ability to go between all those forms, which is nice. But that's only one small part of what they can do. They also have superpowers, magical abilities, if you will, called gifts that are given to them by the spirits of nature themselves, and sometimes other spirits. These let werewolves do amazing things, oftentimes not having to be in their Krynos form and doing werewolfy things. Sometimes as humans, they can walk around and have things happen. They can be very esoteric and, like magical bolts of energy flying off of an accomplished Octena's hands. if you want to invest in some lore in that. Or it could be as simple as a Regabash, that is a person who is born under a new moon, just kind of gliding through a corporation without anybody noticing them, walking, grabbing some files they need, and walking right out again, only using 1 or 2 gifts to do that, because that's their special gifts and talents they've been born with that they develop and can be pretty darn impressive. Maybe not as dramatic as turning into a half-wolf and ripping everything to pieces, but, it's there. On top of that, of course, you're a werewolf. You gotta be aware that werewolves don't like something in particular. Silver, that's real. While everybody else dies very quickly, if you're not a human, if you're not a vampire, you're not a werewolf, death comes pretty easy. Almost anything can kill you if it's determined enough. Werewolves are very hard to kill unless you have silver. Then they become less hard. It becomes a matter of you killing them rather than, you dying way before. You have a chance, at least, if you've got some silver as a weapon. But as far as damage goes, when you are shot as a werewolf, it hurts. It's considered lethal damage, but you heal it relatively quickly. All you have to do is go take a breather, and that bullet wound will just close up, and the bullet just pop, and you're fine. Silver does what's called aggravated damage, and that is supernatural damage that you can't just heal like that. It's hard to get rid of. You can heal from it naturally, which is usually going to leave some nasty scarring, or you can heal from it magically, because some of the gifts that the werewolves can get can be healing, which is incredibly, incredibly useful for a group who get into combats quite frequently, usually. I mean, you get all those war forms for a reason, right? And the fact that some of your group can just go crazy if provoked, because you have rage, and if you are born under the full moon and a rune, you have a lot of rage, and you can get even more than that if you really invest in focusing your rage. It just means you have a hard time maintaining control often. That can be rough. So, you've got rage. You've got gifts. You've got different forms. It feels very good being a werewolf. You feel pretty darn powerful. As a matter of fact, if you cross over with vampire, a starting out just fresh out of character creation vampire has very little chance of tangling with a fresh, straight out of character creation werewolf. The werewolves have a lot of natural advantages, even on vampires. Now, yeah, you take the right clan, say Clan Gangrel or Clan Bruja, yeah, you can get some pretty good fights that way. But, generally speaking, unless silver's introduced, usually those vampires are going to have a really rough time. And vampires can do aggravated damage back to werewolves. They can use their fangs, which are considered aggravated. They do spiritual wounds. So they can fight back. It's just that, werewolves' claws and teeth are usually better. So, there's that. Now, you have the interplay of all these different tribes. This is a problem, because they're based on wolves, right? So there's packs and a pecking order. And werewolves want to be in a pecking order. They want to know where they stand. They can challenge to try to move up the ranks, but as in any given situation, generally your wolves are going to know exactly where they stand in the pecking order of their tribe, of their pack. And the same goes for werewolves. They have a very set pecking order of who's the top tribe, who follows, and so on. And there's tribes that are ambitious and they want to get up to the top, so they will do whatever they can to gain power and whatnot. There also aren't that many werewolves. Considering how many billions of humans there are, the number of werewolves is relatively small. Because being a werewolf is a difficult job. It's a very hazardous career to follow through. Death can come pretty easily. You have a lot of enemies. Werewolves fight other werewolves, it's true. Plus, you've got that whole worm and weaver thing, so if you go into the Umbra, you might have spirits to tangle with that can kill you. And sometimes the weaver and the worm claim their own servants. The worm has their own group of werewolves called Black Spiral Dancers that are very nasty. And generally, the guru will fight to the death against Black Spiral Dancers if they get a chance to, because they are the enemy. They're the ultimate corrupted, dark mirror version of themselves. The Weaver is more of a spiritual thing, more so than a physical thing, generally speaking, but it has allies. One of the tribes of the Garou is called the Glasswalkers, and they're, remember I said Bonars are close to the humans. The Glasswalkers, the Bonars live in the shadow of humanity, the Glasswalkers walk among them. They generally try to take all the advantages that humans covet. Power, wealth, money, influence. Those are actual commodities to the Glasswalkers. And that, to me, makes them the most relatable of all of the Garou. Some of the others can be really hard to roleplay as. But if you are a Glasswalker, you kind of learn how to blend in amongst the Weaver's folk. You're not necessarily seen as an enemy to them because, honestly, you've accepted their world. You understand it, and you've learned to empower yourself through it. To the other Garou, you can be one step away from being the enemy. There's plenty of reason for them to look down their nose at you, mostly because you're comfortable with something they hate. And that's not a good thing for harmony, to say the least. So, you're a werewolf. How did you get to be a werewolf? That's one of the coolest things about Werewolf to me. One of the best parts of the game. And I can't emphasize this enough. Coming into Werewolf for the very first time, or Vampire, should be a magical experience. There's the first change for a werewolf. Just like there is the embrace for a vampire, it's the moment you first hit all of this weirdness. Now, vampires come from humanity. Your first encounter with vampires is probably going to be your embrace, or something like that. For werewolves, they've always been a little weird. They don't have a pleasant childhood usually, unless their parents are somehow protecting them against the worst of it. But oftentimes, they're the weird kid. They're outsiders. Rarely are they the cool person. Although every once in a while you get some that are really charismatic and can draw people. But even so, other people feel odd around them. And then when they change, usually as a result of some great big event, something traumatic, breaking up with a girlfriend, being mugged. Oh boy, there's a lot of them. But usually it's very poignant. It's something happens, everything turns red, they come to, they're in a pile of bodies, torn up. They have no clothes on, everything, maybe, just a couple of ripped scraps, and they're covered in blood, and that's basically your basic first change. Obviously, there's tons of variations on that, but the interesting thing is it's a little bit like birth. You come into it naked and covered with fluids. No, it's you are permanently leaving one world. You can't ever go back to being a human again. You are what you are. And usually the assumption is you are found by the werewolves who draw you into their society. Usually because there's not a lot of you left. They have to be as embracing to everybody who is a werewolf as they can. Number one, it strengthens your numbers. You have more people fighting alongside of you. Number two, you don't want to risk them going over to the enemy, whatever that means. So, yeah, usually your first run is going to be, you have come in from changing for the first time, here's your chance to be introduced to your new family. For the rest of your life, you are a Garou, and that's going to mean finding your place, finding what this all means, learning the rules, and then what do you do from there? Oh, that's going to vary from storyteller to storyteller, quite honestly. Usually, there's a clear and present danger. Some situation is in existence that you're going to have to deal with from the very beginning. If, say, you're in Vancouver. Vancouver is a very cool city, one of my favorite cities for Werewolf. It's a weird city where vampires and werewolves exist side by side. They're not friends, no, but they tolerate each other, and they have rules. The elders on both sides have realized fighting each other is wasteful, incredibly wasteful. Deaths on both sides that you don't need. And actually, there are benefits that you get from allying. For the vampires, those werewolves are stopping hostile vampires from coming in. So they're kind of like guards. As long as, you don't mind the fact they can turn and kill you pretty easily, they keep things safer for you in the long run. And also, they maintain a certain stability in the town. It doesn't get too dark, because there's always these werewolf defenders keeping an eye on humanity too. As long as you don't accidentally go and drain some of their kinfolk, and you keep your crimes to a minimum, it can work out. And for werewolves, the advantages are, well, okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of. So if the vampires you know about are opposed to darker, more evil vampires, the worst kinds, in this case the Sabbat, they can help you to find the Sabbat so that you can snuff them out. That's really good for the young werewolves who want to get all the glory they can. Point me at the bad vampires that I can kill. Also, they can kind of reveal the seedy underside that werewolves' eyes are never privy to, but vampires can get everywhere in society. So another situation of allying yourself with these vampires is you can find interesting targets to go and hunt down that otherwise, just by using werewolf resources alone, you might not have been able to do. It's interesting. It's a fascinating world, and I love the dynamic of it. And there's different ones all throughout the world. There are different centers of werewolf power, oftentimes called septs, is a group of werewolves, and they often cluster around cairns, which is the center of wild energy that can give the werewolves who are attendant to these sacred places new powers and abilities. So that's a lot. I understand. I threw a lot of stuff into this. That's how dynamic this world can be. Now, if you're a savvy storyteller, you don't have to absolutely bury players under all of that. You could just let them see a little bit and unfold the world a little bit at a time and reveal only what you need to, and that, I feel, is the best way to do it. If you immediately slap down a book in front of your players and say, this stuff is all coming out, it's going to be a bit. Really quite a bit. And they'll absorb all the prejudices that you want, and years down the road, they'll still bristle at some groups and remember bad experiences they've had that might color their experiences after that. But it's a fascinating game, and it's one of the interesting ones where a lot of games try to. There's no black or white. There's no good and evil. It's all on a relative scale. With Werewolf, there is evil. There's no doubt that the bad evil is bad evil. When you first fight a Fomori, which is a human who's been corrupted by the worms, they turn into a living monster, there's evil there. You don't even sweat going through a whole horde of Fomori. And because it's set in the modern setting, how do you do that is up to you. There are, say, if you ever have this power fantasy of a werewolf toting a minigun, yeah, if you're a glasswalker with the right connections, that can actually happen, and that could be pretty darn awesome too. But if you want to imagine yourself as this giant, silver, untouchable statuette of moving death, that'll get powerful enough as a Silver Fang, and that might be a reality too. There's a lot of power fantasies that can unfold with Vampire. There's a lot that can unfold with Werewolf. They're both really, really solid games. I just kind of really do dig the Werewolf. You're the good guys, and there's not as many shades of gray. Yeah, you're uncomfortable with some of your allies, certainly, but you can actually go out and feel you're doing good. And I've had some really fun times both playing and running Werewolf. It has been a perennial favorite of mine. I don't run it all the time, but when I do, I often find the players really find it easy to suspend the disbelief and kind of step into the boots of a werewolf, but still maintain personal goals and interests. Why? Because you're playing a real person in a real world, and we all understand people like that. Some people love to live on, say, McDonald's all the time. That's something they value, being able to do that. Okay, it's not what I like, but I can kind of see a person doing that. Whereas if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, what's your character's favorite food? 9/10 of the players out there couldn't tell you. or they would just be making it up on the spot because they never really thought about it. So we understand, we can connect, and we can make those characters feel a little bit more realistic. And if you want to double down on the personal horror, the rage that can cause you to snap and commit atrocities, yeah, that can happen pretty easily too. Especially, you know, if you time a certain adventure towards the right phase of the moon, you're going to find people are going to have a hard time not raging, and this can lead to some very interesting roleplay moments. But on the other hand, if you're just looking for a hero fantasy where you could be this huge combat monster and just roar, and even the weakest person among you is still far more than a match for a standard human, so you can all contribute and do something cool together, Werewolf's a pretty good game for that. So, some cases, better than Vampire was. Those are my takes on it. If you haven't tried Werewolf yourself, it's, like I said, I think it's pretty good. I also love the system, the D10 dice pool system. It's add up stat and attribute, roll that number of dice. But what I like about the original World of Darkness, better than I like about the rewrite, is that having a sliding difficulty system adds nuance and challenge to running the game, and actually makes it kind of simple to adjudicate how tough something is. Rather than needing a certain number of successes, it's just simply, if my difficulty, I wanted to see how many successes you can get, I can set the difficulty at a 3 and just let you pile on success on success on success, and we could see just how well you can sustain something or crush something. As opposed to, yeah, you're going to try that, it's really, really hard, difficulty is really high, but I have a lot of dice, so I've got a chance. Okay. Either way, works pretty good. So, that's Werewolf in a bottle for me. I liked the game, and I will go over character creation. I will go over how it's played for those of you who are interested, but it was a game that I liked, and again, this is more of a fleshed out answer from my friend Brian, who was interested in modern games that didn't necessarily have wizards casting spells and people in plate armor running around. It's a modern setting. Yeah, there's people with armor. Yeah, there's people with guns. But Werewolf is just a lot of fun, and you can tell some fascinating stories with it. So, hopefully this whetted your appetite. Knowing about a new game is exciting to me, and pretty soon I will have more to show you. So, hopefully look forward to that. Maybe this was useful to you. If it was, let me know. If you have experiences with Werewolf and you think it was a great game, comments below. We'd love to hear the story. And if you disliked Werewolf, something about it really, was a bone in your craw, you could not stomach it, we could talk about that too. But anyhow, that's my take on Werewolf the Apocalypse. So, until next time, I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and hopefully we'll see you at the next lesson or the next talk along, whichever. Until then, farewell.